Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. We've got three great scholars who are going to speak to us. But first of all, I was reviewing James Lee Burke's new book, Another Kind of Eden. He's a great crime mystery writer, gorgeous lyrical prose. Here is his opening paragraph. The events I'm about to describe may challenge credulity. I do not blame the reader. Young Goodman Brown wanders these pages. The macabre images, the Gothic characters, the perfume from a poisonous garden could have been created with the ink from Nathaniel Hawthorne's pen. So this novel just came out last month in August. So it still shows Hawthorne's power today as we talk about him. Let me introduce first Professor Charles Baraw, who teaches at Southern Connecticut State University. And he teaches incredible courses. I'm looking at the list from graphic narrative to images, but he's also out there in advance talking about the pedagogy of comics and animal studies, the poetic tourism, and all kinds of things. Chuck is also presently the president of the Nathaniel Hawthorne Society and has talked many times at different conferences. Our second scholar is Monika Elbert, who is a distinguished university scholar at Montclair State University. And she has written a book, she's written many, but a book that I particularly used entitled Hawthorne in Context, that was published by Cambridge in 2018. And she's very interested in the stories of Louisa May Alcott and women in the 19th century. Our third scholar is Professor Brenda Wineapple, who has written incredible things. Her biography on Nathaniel Hawthorne, I think, is one of the best because it's the most balanced. It's not trying to prove that bourgeoisie marriage is terrible or that gender relations are out to kill one another. It just takes everything into account as part of the fascinating human condition and the mysteries built into it. Hawthorne, A Life, has been well received, as has her book on Emily Dickinson, White Heat, which I'm using in a seminar this semester, as has her book, Ecstatic Nation, Confidence, Crisis, and Compromise, 1846 to 1877. All of these three scholars are very interested in, have talked about, and written about Hawthorne. But as you can see, they also have wider interests. And so these kind of play into one another. Let's start probably with Chuck Baraw, who will get us off to a start. And we're responding to Poe's quote, which is easy to respond to because to me it doesn't make any sense. It just says, Hawthorne is remarkable. He's purity itself. His tone is singularly effective. I have no idea what that means. So Chuck, I'll throw that quote to you and the floor is yours.
So you stole my thunder a little there, Sam, because I have no idea either. So we'll just pass that on to Monika and Brenda, who may just pass it back to you in the end anyways. But first I want to thank Chris for having us all to talk about Hawthorne and the NAS, and specifically for inviting me to take time to reconsider Twice Told Tales in conversation with you also, my esteemed colleagues. It's been a long time since I looked closely at Twice Told Tales as a book, that is as a collection of tales and sketches published at the start of Hawthorne's career in 1837. So it's been a lot more common for me, as I suspect for others, to focus on certain, my favorite or most puzzling tales. In my case, it's been tales I've taught for years, which are probably the most anthologized. Young Goodman Brown, which Sam cited via Another Kind of Eden, The Minister's Black Veil, My Kinsman Major Molyneux, Roger Melvin's Burial, The Birthmark. But there are also really weird tales, or what Hawthorne might call queer stories and sketches, that I found myself teaching more frequently and writing about as a Hawthorne scholar. These include Wakefield, Little Annie's Ramble, The Lily's Quest, which I might be the only person obsessed with in America today, Monsieur de Miroir, Alice Doane's Appeal, and My Visit to Niagara. Only the first three of these were published in Twice Told Tales, and the last two were never published in a collection after first printing in 1835. So I've been working on these tales for so long as interrelated but freestanding texts that each has their own distinct and fascinating publication history in the emerging American literary marketplace, that when I look back at preparing for today, when I look back at Twice Told Tales, I discovered that I've come to think of the uncollected or excluded tales from the 1830s as somehow haunting what we call Twice Told Tales. In a few cases, this haunting led me to misremember these other tales as actually being contained in the original volumes, as if they somehow found their place to create a ghostly presence where after 175 years. So I just literally changed the shape of the book in my head. And what this struck me, that one of the first things about Twice Told Tales is that it's such a fluid text. It changes from the 1837 first edition to the 1844 second volume to, again, the 1851 reprinting with addition of Hawthorne's famous preface. And as I've said, it might even absorb the contemporaneous but excluded tales and sketches as unacknowledged kin. And all this raises a question for me: what are we talking about when we talk about Twice Told Tales? Like, in a literal sense, do we mean the 1837 edition of 18 tales, the 1844 two-volume 39 tales, or the 1851 that I would argue has 40 tales, as Hawthorne says, if we include his self-mythologizing portrait of the capital A author in the preface to that edition? I think we should take that as a story, and a really important story for us. Or are we talking more broadly about the whole range of tales and sketches hauntingly present for me, which Hawthorne produced in the 1830s? Like, we could go up to 1844 when the Twice Told Tales second volume came out, and stop at the Old Manse before he wrote a bunch of new tales that came out in that book. Or should we look at all of them together, right? And this kind of matters to me. They're not quibbling questions of a pedant, I hope. If they strike you as that, forgive me. But I think that the material history of publication and composition and reception has to be brought to bear on our contemporary readings of Hawthorne. And the fluid, dynamic, even self-contradictory story of the text of Twice Told Tales points to qualities I think are central to reading Hawthorne and his contribution to American letters. And for me, I want to emphasize that self-contradictory story. Things don't fit neatly together. And as his Hawthorne's self-deprecating and yet somehow cheeky title indicates, these works are retold, republished twice, thrice, or more, and by implication, reread. And that's a second point for me. We reread in a dynamic process that's fluid when the tales are published. For instance, in other words, people could read a tale in 1836 Token Gift Annual in a fancy bound, gilt, lavishly illustrated book that's really a present and an object of conspicuous consumption. They can read them again in 1837. They can read them again in 1851. They can read long quotes in various print publications of the time. But we, of course, have been rereading them for almost 175 years, almost 200 years. And I guess my point in starting with this is that I think the history of the construction of the book is analogous to a demand for rereading that's built in, that there's a built-in recursivity that inheres in Hawthorne's form and style. In other words, we go through, we get to the end, we have to go back to the beginning. And this can happen even within the tale. And if we don't, then we're kind of in danger of a kind of, I guess I would even say misreading. So Hawthorne writes tales that demand we reread them to figure out what's really going on. So I see that each individual tale as resisting fixity, and maybe more to the point, they resist closure. a final settling of moral, psychological, and historical questions they raise. So I'm not just talking about Hawthorne's famed ambiguity, which we know happens on the level of the sentence. It's beautifully illustrated in the Scarlet Letter, and earlier, where you get, even within a sentence, self-contradiction, reversal, hesitation. But certainly one sentence can point back to another and ask us to have to think again. This is what's so significant to me about Hawthorne. So I'm trying to emphasize an insistent habit of critical reflection that often undermines, sometimes very subtly, explicit morals at the end of a Hawthorne tale. And that's really my main take when I think about all of it, however we conceive of the Twice Told Tales of these tales. Hawthorne critics and readers debate the status of the sort of explicit moments of closure at the end of Hawthorne tales. But I'm of a school that celebrates Hawthorne's historical imagination. I think this is the most important thing and probably the most apropos of today, that, that's really his contribution to questions of Americanness and American literary history. It's a kind of historical imagination that makes me think of what the narrative theorists, one of the things I'm obsessed with narrative theory, H. Porter Abbott calls passionate thinking. And Abbott talks about this as to distinguish fiction from argument. And it strikes me as useful here that Hawthorne's passionate thinking in these stories and sketches is a way of setting questions in motion, aided by the feeling and imaginative presence that narrative makes possible. So he can have an incident, a historical incident, an observation of contemporary life, a thought experiment, and he uses the tools of narrative, whether the nonfiction sketch, which his sketches strike me as sort of bordering on the fictional. We could talk about Little Annie's Ramble in that sense, or of straight out fiction, to put us in an imaginary story world and set problems in motion. And that's distinct from an argument with a settled proposition. So, some critics would tend more towards that side. And I'm saying, I think we should tend towards the other. So when Hawthorne seems to present a clear proposition or moral, that's when I become most critically alert as a reader and go back and do that recursive reading. I'm not paying that much attention to time, but let me just give you one example here that I think I have time for. From The Great Champion, which is the opening story in Twice Told Tales. The title alone announces its heroic subject. We have a champion. We have it sort of points back to romance and I don't know, almost the Knights of the Round Table, but it's also a tale that's clearly grounded in history, like factual, demonstrable context. So at the end of this story, Hawthorne presents one of the most patriotic passages I think you can find in Hawthorne. Now remember, this is the opening story of the book. And it ends like this. I can read, excuse me. Long may it be ere he comes again. This is the great champion that stopped the tyrant, Governor Andros, and also stopped potentially violence with the inhabitants of the city. His hour is one of darkness and adversity and peril. But should domestic tyranny oppress us, or the invader's step pollute our soil, still may the great champion come, for he is the type of New England's hereditary spirit. I mean, you can't get more explicit than this. And you use the word type, especially for a writer who's imbued with, understanding of Puritan theology. That's a heavy-duty word. For he is the type of New England's hereditary spirit, and his shadowy mark on the eve of danger must ever be the pledge that New England's sons will vindicate their ancestry. So, wow, this is a prophecy, or it's history as prophecy. It's also a really strange kind of I don't know, I was thinking of the laying on of hands, but it's saying you have this duty that is always in the future, you will vindicate your ancestry. And, we know that Hawthorne's relation to his ancestry is very fraught. Like, they did some things that he didn't feel very good about. Many things. So I find this just fascinating. What a way to end your first story. So when you reread it and go back, I just two quick points that I noticed. The first is the opening sentence. And it goes like this. Here was once a time when New England groaned under the actual pressure of heavier wrongs than those threatened ones which brought on the revolution. Now, this is kind of a throwaway because he doesn't talk about the revolution at all in the rest of the story, except for maybe in that forward-thinking duty prophecy to rise up. But really, he's making a negative comparison to the revolution. It seems really odd to me to do in 1837. Like, then they really had cause to revolt, but they did it because this spirit hero rose up. It's very strange. And to me, it's that kind of unsettling when we go back. It unsettles the whole story. And one of the things I noticed in that unsettled state, it comes up in a few paragraphs later. This isn't a long catalog, and Hawthorne loves these catalogs. He gets this love from Spencer and other writers from our old home across the water. He's cataloging the sort of noble soldiers in the crowd, the seniors, when Andros is threatening to suppress all liberties. And the third group he comes to is these people. Here also were the veterans of King Philip's War, who had burnt villages and slaughtered young and old with pious fierceness, while the godly souls throughout the land were helping them with prayer. And he just drops it. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't explicate. He doesn't give any moral judgments about burning villages and slaughtering young and old with pious fierceness, while somewhere else, the people not in the front line are helping with prayer. It's just this moment for critical doubt, for re-seeing and rereading that comes in the middle of the story before we get that, patriotic prophecy at the end. So my broader point is that what characteristic of Hawthorne's historical imagination, it's not just that he so persistently imagines historical episodes to recuperate for his own day. And he does this. There are many, many tales that bring things forward into his present that might be forgotten moments of history, and in a way creates his own history by doing that. And that's, important for then, and it's important for us. And he plumbs, when he does it, significant cruxes in moral and intellectual history, as Michael J. Colicurcio taught us to see decades ago in The Province of Piety. But to me, Hawthorne's is a critical historical imagination. It opens things up, it sets things in motion, and it did then, and it still is 175 years later. And that is the most important contribution from my point of view. And that's terrific. That's a great setup. I like the whole fluid dynamic thing. Somebody once wrote that Hawthorne thinks in fiction, that he's trying to work out, dramatize these kind of questions that he has and stuff like that. And I'm wondering, and we can come back to this, if he's writing in almost, but not quite, a vacuum where he's seeking readers and creating in his own mind the American romance. And I've always wondered in his own mind, what the hell does that mean? Because he has some guidelines, but not many. He's not like inventing in the middle of nothing, but in a way, he is doing that. And Monika, I don't mean to set you up with those questions. I just toss them out there because I'd love to come back to them that Chuck raised. So if Monika, we could turn it over to you, and whatever you'd like to offer about Hawthorne, feel free.
I'm going to share my screen, and I'd like to advertise the Hawthorne Review, of which I'm the editor, and we have a really good issue coming out on Hawthorne and pandemics and what he might have thought of the pandemic. Remember, he went through a cholera epidemic. It was more so in Canada than in the United States, but he avoided going to Canada for a moment because he said, I don't want to get this disease. So I'm going to share the lovely frontispiece. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, it's a big one, but you see him masked. And this is from the Hawthorne Hotel in Salem, which says that face coverings are required. And I couldn't get it to be smaller. But you can see,
mask.
but you can see Hawthorne masked. I thought that was great. And they allowed me to put it as the front image of the issue. So I also want to point out that an issue that is delayed because of the pandemic from last fall deals specifically with Hawthorne and the short story. It's both from Twice Told Tales and Mosses from an Old Man. So if you join our society, you will get copies of these. And let me share now my other screen. I'm going to briefly talk about the recurrent themes of Twice Told Tales, both the first and the second volume. And you can divide it up pretty much into these various areas. He's obviously obsessed with local and national history. And we can see these in stories that have already been mentioned: The Great Champion, The Maypole of Merrymount, The Great Carbuncle, Gentle Boy, and The Cot and the Red Cross. What's interesting, and this kind of goes with what Chuck said, is The Maypole of Merrymount also shows this critique of government and trying to break away and have this kind of freedom, where you have the Thomas Morton image. He wants to make this a freer society and everybody's enjoying themselves. And all of a sudden, John Endicott comes around and says, no, cut down the maypole. You cannot do this. It has to be this very strict sense of the Puritan way of being spiritually and also nationally. And then also, these are stories that have often not been paid sufficient attention to, the legends of the Province House, more recently than have in the last decade. But they're definitely, if you're interested in Hawthorne as the myth maker and historian of American history, these are the ones to read together. There's also this moment in Lady Eleanor's mantle. Supposedly she's stricken down with smallpox. I'm obsessed with pandemics at the moment, as you can tell, because I just did the special issue. And he's very much aware of psychological nuances. These are the stories my students probably enjoy the most. Minister of Black Veil, I'm just giving, a few of them. There are more stories in the 2 volumes of Twice Told Tales: Wakefield, Dr. Heidegger's Experiment, and The Haunted Mind, which can be seen as supernatural, but also I think he has a good grip on the psychological workings of, humanity and paying attention to this inner life. And then there are the sketches and attention to everyday life in detail that Christy Hamilton wrote a great book about 15 or 20 years ago. Some of the best work on his sketches has been done by her. And sometimes people are bored with these texts. I'm going to read you a section from Poe later. Poe is not fascinated by these particular works. I think it's really good local color. You really get the sense of New England. You get a sense of how Hawthorne felt living in New England. You get a sense of the past through the everyday. I mean, he's almost like the everyday historian here, which kind of contrasts with his way of being the historian of the nation. So in some ways, these feel more relaxed and more relaxing. And then there's dark humor. Down to, Wakefield is a very tragic story. He leaves his wife, comes back and says, honey, I'm home again. And it should be tragic, but for some reason, there's this bittersweet, why are we laughing about this in the end? And we don't understand. Mr. Higginbottom's Catastrophe, about which I've written, deals a lot with New England's racism, but also fear and dislike of the Irish, this racist story against the Irish as well. But there's some strange humor about the way the story about his death, which is not a death in the end, is communicated to the local peddler. And in some ways, this relates to news and false news and rumors. So in my mind, that's very interesting. Although there is that very ominous sense of the prejudice against the Irish and the African American in the story. Then there are supernatural stories that some contemporary critics of Hawthorne's connected him to Irving and Sir Walter Scott. Some of this you can see in The Haunted Mind, The Ambitious Guest, or the Night Sketches. And of course, there's the understanding of children's psyche, as Chuck also brought up, because he was a famous writer of children's stories. And then this particular volume, of course, you have Little Annie's Rambles that takes place in front of a candy store that is still in existence in Salem. I think it's still there unless the pandemic made it go away, dealing with, it's the first candy store in America. I go there every time I go to Salem. I haven't been there recently. And then The Gentle Boy, which deals with a child's love of a mother, the Quaker mother versus the Puritan mother, and he's abandoned. And at the end, the mother comes back, the true mother, and he's dying because he's homesick for the mother. And in some ways, that tight relationship between that bond between mother and child is repeated in The Scarlet Letter, but you see it in The Gentle Boy already, which, by the way, Elizabeth Peabody decided that was his worst story he ever wrote. Other critics, which I'll point out, enjoyed it a great deal or thought it was a better one. I'm going to skip the first anonymous criticism just to go to Longfellow. And Longfellow says, now remember, Longfellow is a classmate of his, so he can't be that mean. But at Bowdoin, they went to school together. He definitely says great positive comments here. One of the most prominent characteristics of these tales is that they are national in their character. The author has wisely chosen his themes among the traditions of New England. And then he also repeats something, or he says something that other critics will repeat, that he does have this concept of nature. And Melville will talk about this later in Mosses from an Old Man's, Hawthorne and his Mosses. Says it's as clear as running waters are. Indeed, he uses words as mere stepping stones upon which, with a free and youthful bound, his spirits cross and recross. His spirit crosses and recrosses the bright and rushing stream of thought. So even though Hawthorne is not a transcendentalist, he's often associated with his nature imagery. Now, Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, who is very fond of Hawthorne, and his sister Sophia marries Hawthorne later in 1842. She is a great public relations person for Hawthorne. She often said the most delightful things about his work. And she says he has this apparent leisure with which he lingers around the smallest point of fact and unfolds therefrom a world of thought, just as if nothing else existed in the outward universe about that of which he's speaking. And then she contrasts it to America at the moment, the hurried manner that seems to have become the American habit. The spirit of the steam engine and railroad has never entered into him, which isn't totally true, because there are moments of that. You see it in the story that David Swan, you see that the world is kind of taking place outside his little mind that's fallen asleep in the, at the side of the wayside, but we know that there's commerce going on. But Peabody concludes that the greatest artist will be the greatest benefactor of our country, and art is the highest interest of our state, for it is the only principle of conservatism our Constitution allows, a beauty which at once delights the eye, touches the heart, and projects its spirit into the world to come. There'll be something too precious to be weighed against the banks of a great commerce. Again, she's attacking commerce and saying, and then the empirical politician, she's saying literature will save us. It'll go against the nastiness of politics and of commerce. Now, Poe has a very interesting view of Hawthorne, of these twice told tales. And he basically says, and this is about the second edition, it professes to be a collection of tales, but is it really? This is misnamed, it's a misnomer. These pieces are now in their third republication, some of these pieces, and of course are thrice told. However, they are because some of them were published in the Democratic Review and elsewhere, they are by no means all tales, either in the ordinary or in the legitimate understanding of the terms. Many of them are pure essays, for example, Sights from a Steeple, Sunday at Home, Little Annie's Ramble, A Rill from the Town Home, Pump, The Tollgather's Day, The Haunted Mind, The Sister Years, etc., etc. And then he critiques them by saying, this isn't real literature. These are sketches, and I have an issue with that. But he then goes on to compliment them after he says, well, I don't really see them as tales, but they're okay. He says, all is quiet, thoughtful, subdued, yet this repose may exist simultaneously with high originality thought. And Mr. Hawthorne had demonstrated the fact. And he says the tales belong, when he goes to the tales, and he says these belong to the highest region of art. He says his distinctive trait is invention, creation, imagination, originality. And then he concludes by saying, we have scarcely a word to say of these tales. There is perhaps a somewhat too general or prevalent tone, a tone of melancholy and mysticism. The subjects are insufficiently varied. And yet he ends on a positive note. So he changes his mind often. In this particular case, in this review, he's positive about the stories. Longfellow also comes back and is very positive, but he adds one statement, which he didn't have in the earlier text. He said, in the early review of the first edition, he said, he doesn't delve that much into the supernatural, which is good because we have too much of that going on. Here he says that element, Hawthorne indulges in or has the power of finding the elements of the picturesque, the romantic, and even the supernatural to the everyday commonplace life that's constantly going on around us. He detects the essentially poetical and that what is supposedly prosaic. So here too, what he says, and I think that Chuck says it too, they're the two sides of Hawthorne. There's the more supernatural open-ended and there's the everyday, and he kind of likes this combination. Longfellow does. He says the history, the traditions, the people, the scenes of New England have not generally been supposed favorable to the romance writer or the poet, but in Hawthorne's hand, they're fruitful and suggestive and dispose themselves into graceful attitudes and dramatic combinations. And then he uses examples of the text that he really enjoys: David Swan, Minister's Black Veil, The Seven Vagabonds, and Edward Fane's Rosebud. Again, many of these stories are not anthologized for students. The students that I teach generally have Minister's Black Veil, and then in the Mosses from an Old Man's, of course, I like the science fiction stories, Rappaccini's Daughter and Birthmark, etc. But in this particular case, Longfellow does point out the supernatural qualities, and he says the most successful manner in which he deals with the supernatural, he blends together with skillful hands the two worlds of the seen and the unseen. But also he does something here that is quite positive. He says his genius is characterized by a large proportion of feminine elements, depth and tenderness of feeling, exceeding purity of mind, and a certain airy grace and arch vivacity in narrating incidents and delineating characters. The strength and beauty of a mother's love are poured over the exquisite story, The Gentle Boy, which are attempted to pronounce as, on the whole, the finest thing he ever wrote. Again, critics had different opinions. Peabody thought this wasn't the best story, it was the worst. In this case, Longfellow thinks it's the best. And remember, this whole idea of mother and child's relationship is further explored in the Scarlet Letter. And then one other comment, he discusses Hawthorne's knowledge of the child's mind and habit. He praises Hawthorne for understanding women's way of thinking. Every woman owes him a debt of gratitude for those lovely visions of womanly faith, tenderness, and truth, which glide so gracefully through his pages. Now, many feminist critics of the 80s and forward disagreed with this pronouncement. I did not, and Nina Bain did not. We both thought that Hawthorne was very sympathetic to women's needs and fears and ways of being. So I kind of like how Longfellow summarizes it here. And the last comment I have was John O'Sullivan, who was the editor of the Democratic Review, who published a lot of Hawthorne, focuses on the New England background and says from his own mind, with the accumulated experience of New England life, he draws his inspiration. It is from New England history and social existence that he derives his hints and materials. New England traditions, New England incidents, New England customs, New England manners are the staples of his productions. I mean, it's a little bit too much. It's a little too patriotic, but notice he doesn't include All America here, which is a problem. Melville will correct that in Hawthorne in his Mosses, where he says Hawthorne represents all America, not just New England. He's got all of the Niagara of his soul and so forth. He's not just New England. He's like a Virginian. Melville makes himself out to be a a Virginian. He pretends he's a Virginian writer. So this is an early kind of way of saying he just kind of imbibes the history and the geography of New England, and he's one of our best, and we need to kind of value him for that. I think that's about it. Am I under or over time, or is that good?
That's fine. It was terrific. Well,
Okay.
what's really interesting, Monika, all these reviews give us different images of Hawthorne. Like when Chuck was talking about how he resists closure, so does his personality.
Mm-hmm.
How can one critic, Longfellow, talk about his stories are fresh like a fresh morning in May? Who the hell is he talking about? And then the other,
Yeah, I think Longfellow is talking about himself as a poet.
And then Poe talks about his melancholy. This is an interesting segue too, it seems to me, to Brenda Wineapple's biography, because in her biography, she manages to take all these different points of view as seen in the personality itself, without the personality seeming some schizophrenic, psychopathological, whatever, but seeing them as different facets of this one person. That one doesn't threaten the other. They all kind of conjoin in one view. So as we move on to Brenda, I'm not trying to put you.
I just want to end with this
too,
though, because a lot of the critics saw him as not using promising materials, but from the everyday life, that idea of the sketch comes in. And that's why many years ago, there was an essay, not remember who wrote, about Hawthorne as realist. Yeah. And maybe Sam, you remember who that is. So some of these reviews speak to that other aspect of it. It's not just the romantic writer, but also a realist.
I agree. And they're also writing at a time when everybody seems very aware of saying, okay, we're free from Great Britain, but we're still a British culture in terms of the kind of books we read and stuff, and we have to invent an American fiction, an American style. And so Hawthorne must have felt that pressure, and all of these people writing similarly felt the same way. But that's just an afterthought. Brenda, we'll move on to you so you can summarize all of this brilliantly and tell us, what does Hawthorne mean to you?
Well, thanks, Sam. And again, thank you all. It's nice to see you and to meet people like Chuck. And I want to thank Chris and the Center for Scholars and Writers for inviting us all in this very unusual program. And it really got me to thinking back about Hawthorne. And I haven't really thought intensely about him in a pretty long time. So it was fun for me. I teach in nonfiction MFA programs, so I don't have the American literature students that Monika and Chuck and Sam were talking about. And when I do teach Hawthorne, I usually teach his chiefly about war matters, which was not a twice told tale, and it was not collected. It's a complicated piece that appeared during the Civil War in the Atlantic Monthly. And I teach it primarily because it's a revelation to students that Hawthorne could be so quote unquote modernist, that he bears a relationship to David Foster Wallace, they find, and it's very exciting for them. Excuse me, and that's interesting to me for several reasons, but also because of what both certainly just Monika was talking about, the critical reception of Hawthorne, and also what Chuck was talking about is Hawthorne's fluidity and his ability, I would call it, excuse me, a kind of almost evasive ability that he has, evading, and to use, again, Chuck's word, I think a settled definition or a settled proposition, which I find fascinating. And it brings us to the whole idea of these twice told tales, which the previous wonderful speakers have been talking about. And as everyone probably knows, and I'm not telling anyone anything that anybody doesn't know already, but just to sort of reconsider Hawthorne in this context, he is taking the collection's title, even as it reformulates itself, as everybody's saying. He's taking it from Shakespeare, King John, and which is so interesting because it gives him a kind of authority. And you have to remember, this is early in his career, where he said he was like a man in a dark place talking to himself, basically. And from King John, we have life is as tedious as a twice told tale, vexing the dull ear of a drowsy man. And then you have that kind of ironic self-deprecation that becomes part of, the Hawthorne corpus in a certain sense. And then I was interested too in what Monika was saying about the critical reception of Hawthorne, in that we have several of his friends, or somebody who will become a close friend, Longfellow. Hawthorne was kind of courting him at this particular time, but certainly John O'Sullivan, people like that, were giving him very positive reviews. Even Poe is, on the fence as Poe can be. Poe could have been much meaner than he was, because it's Poe after all. But what was interesting to me too is the fact that in the preface to the second edition, he kind of takes issue with these reviews that he got. And he's kind of pushing back a little bit, and he talks about on the internal evidence of the sketches, he, meaning himself, came to be regarded as a mild, shy, gentle, melancholic, exceedingly sensitive, not very forcible man, hiding his blushes under assumed name. And he's saying, you're calling me girly. And I don't particularly like that in that particular sense. And as I said, he's pushing back, and then he's sort of semi-hostile, passive aggressive, what we call it today. I think he says by no means certain that some of his subsequent productions, my subsequent productions, have not been influenced by a natural desire to fill up so amiable an outline and to act in consonance with the character assigned to him. So, he's a very interesting person who, as he says very famously later on, 10 years later almost, in the Scarlet Letter, that he's going to hide the inmost need behind the veil. And one has to really wonder about that. And it's interesting because when you think about Hawthorne, and as I started to say, one of the things that one thinks about, not from the so-called scholarly point of view, but in terms of a popular point of view, it's, when Hawthorne was writing, just to interrupt myself, because of what Sam was saying vis-a-vis what Monika was saying, the pressure to write an American book was very much on these writers. They were responding. There's a man writing the Edinburgh Review, Sidney Smith, said, who reads an American book? And Longfellow and Hawthorne, and they're all kind of charging in, going to say, we're going to write the American book. That happens all the way through the 20th century. I'm going to write the American book. In any event, in this particular case, Hawthorne is very conscious of what he's doing, excuse me, but at the same time, we today, in whatever it is, I can't even keep track anymore, we've lost 2 years, in 2021, confront an era in which we might say, who reads a Hawthorne book? Basically, I think high school students still read Scarlet Letter, maybe, or excerpts from it, because everything seems to be excerpted at this particular point. And when the call came for Twice Told Tales, I was fascinated by that, because I, as a reader, started reading Hawthorne, as many of people here probably did. And I'm from New England, in fact, so I get a lot of Hawthorne, mostly Whittier, but that's another story. Started reading Hawthorne in high school and was terrified basically by him, because you read stories, as Chuck and Monika were suggesting, you read the often anthologized stories, presumably geared to high school students that no high school student, I think, on the planet could ever forget. Wakefield, or The Ambitious Guest, or The Minister's Black Veil, which completely, from my point of view, defied any kind of explanation that made sense. And as a result, they really stay with us. So I don't know what happens today, but in people reading Hawthorne, or getting them to read Hawthorne. And one of the things that was interested in, going back to Twice Told Tales, is here you have an author who is so, to my mind, ambivalent about revelation. And here you have an author in reconsidering him in 2021, as we are all doing, in a world that is fixated on revelation, revealing what I think at the moment, tweeting and Facebook, social media, even standard, presumably conservative journalists all seem to me to use the first person. Mm-hmm. And Hawthorne is coming from a very different place. His place is coming from almost a kind of Flaubertian dream of impersonality, and the sense that, I'm not going to tell you who I am exactly, and I'm not going to allow you to reach a final conclusion about me. And yet in these stories, and I think that especially scholars who are interested in them know the history of scholarship about Hawthorne has been often deeply focused on who this person is. What is he like? What is behind that particular veil? Partly because he invites us to make those kinds of questions to ourselves. And Hawthorne, I think when you look back at the story, sees storytelling in just that way, sort of reflecting partly what I think Chuck was saying, in the sense that he's hiding himself. He's saying, that there, and I'm I'll quote a little bit from a letter, and so far as I can remember it, and this is much later, and he's always talking about the absence of self-revelation. He said there's, he doesn't want to reveal himself, that he doesn't want to reveal his tenderest emotions to the world at large, because you're mistaken in thinking that you're individual, but you cannot be mistaken in thinking you speak for your fellow creatures, so that it's not me in my books. It's almost like Emily Dickinson, she says, this is my letter to the world who never spoke to me, but it's not me. When she writes to Higginson, she says it's an assumed persona. And yet you have someone like his sister-in-law, Mary Peabody Mann, writing to her son about Hawthorne toward the very end of his life, very astutely, as his family happened to be, or at least she was in any case. She says, we'll all have it by and by in Hawthorne's books, for he always puts himself into his books. He cannot help it. And anyone who writes, whatever kind of writing, perhaps not academic writing, I'm not so sure about that, but anyone who writes knows that there is a great deal of self, no matter how you want to disguise it, in your own writing. And I think that is really very powerful, very important for understanding Hawthorne without necessarily an intentional fallacy or anything like that, but to realize that, as I go back, and that again, use Chuck's term, the fluidity, that there's a kind of back and forth. It's a back and forth in terms of what he feels about himself. It's a back and forth in what he feels about America. It's a back and forth in what he feels about his critics. It's a back and forth in terms of what he feels about his ancestors. It's a back and forth in terms of what he feels about current events, you know, even his friend Franklin Pierce and slavery. It's a back and forth. He is unsettled. He's radically unsettled. He's making an art of that unsettlement, which is, I think, why modernists, you know, like him so much. And at the same time, you know, that he is deeply, deeply gravitates toward subjective characters, subjective creatures, even in those so-called sketches or those rambles. And he's deeply fascinated by self-destructive characters. You see that early on in The Minister's Black Veil, whatever that guy's doing, still kind of makes no sense to me. Pandemics notwithstanding, but and these are characters, if you want to use a more kind of theological terminology, well, I don't think it's necessarily appropriate, but it's useful. These are characters who somehow have fallen from grace or fallen out of something. They're, as Wakefield is called, another terrifying story, terrified all the way to the 20th century, Paul Auster. There are constant reenactments of Wakefield. You know, you'll be the outcast of the universe. It's, as I said, a fall from grace. You live outside the bounds of family and society, which is someplace Hawthorne had surrounded by family. He also was ambivalent, it seems to me, about that in his own writing. So it's always on the verge of something, on the verge of an outsider who is really, in many ways, from a 21st century point of view, consummate insider, you know, in terms of the critical terminology we have. And yet at the same time is all this, it seems to me, bubbles up. There's a clinical aspect to Hawthorne. There's an ability to observe the world almost without emotion, almost, you know, almost, as I said, hostilely, almost contemptuously. I think Melville was in a certain sense attracted to that. I mean, Melville was attracted to a lot of things, but I think that was one of the things. And it's almost as he, again, has this push-pull relationship with what he sees. And we haven't talked about this, you can't talk about Hawthorne really without talking about guilt, but the guilt is not, I think the guilt, you know, the sins of the fathers and all that, it's really guilt for what he feels, his own irascibility, his own anger, his own kind of hostility, his own sense of dislocation, which he's able to transmit, it seems, to us, and in so doing gives us a kind of literature that brings us here, you know, to talk about him now. In that sense, you know, so I would use the term, somebody said, I think it was Monika said, talking about his humor. There is humor, not a whole lot, but there is humor, like in the Custom House, but certainly in Wakefield, when Hawthorne is one of my favorite lines, because it seems so shocking to me, given the way Hawthorne composes a you know, really beautifully balanced sentence, when he calls Wakefield a crafty nincompoop, you know, and it's just like really sort of really sort of on the edge there in some sense. And I would say that really in some ways, that's Hawthorne. He's a crafty, not nincompoop, but he's certainly crafty in that particular way. And I think that's partly why he appeals. And the way I would begin to sort of, I guess you would call this my ramble in a certain sense, but the way I would begin to conclude is that I would actually have recourse to a different writer, one I think who's decidedly influenced by Hawthorne, and one who is still almost compulsively read today, when I'm not sure, and perhaps the attendees will discuss this, not sure how much he is really read, Hawthorne is really read today outside of certain kinds of domains. But one of the writers that I think Virginia Woolf was enormously influenced by Hawthorne. That's my own thinking about it. But not even that, I'm thinking him in the so-called American literature, in terms of the beloved American literature writers who kind of defy fashion in some sense, or create it. You've got an Emily Dickinson. And when I think of very early Hawthorne in a story, nobody looks at it, it seems to me, but what do I know? Maybe everybody looks at it. It's called The Hollow of Three Hills. And let me just look at a tiny bit with you and then read you something of Dickinson. And my point will be, I'll tell you my point in advance, in case you want to tune out, is that Hawthorne has a way of depicting an internal register that is very much like Dickinson's. Dickinson uses a very fresh, original, imaginative, electric, poetic style. Hawthorne's style is very, very different. There's a kind of subdued, disturbing quality underneath the serene surface. But I think you'll see it's toward the end of The Hollow of Three Hills. It's the penultimate paragraph, and I'm going to start in the middle of it. There's someone, there's a tolling of the bell stole in among the intervals of her words, like a clang that had traveled far over valley and rising ground and was just ready to die in the air. The lady shook upon her companion's knees as she heard that boding sound. Stronger it grew and sadder, and deepened into the tone of a death bell, knolling dolefully from some ivy-mantled tower, and bearing tidings of mortality and woe to the cottage, to the hall, and to the solitary wayfarer, that all might weep for the doom appointed in turn to them. Then came a measured tread, passing slowly, slowly on, as of mourners with a coffin, their garments trailing on the ground, so that the ear could measure the length of their melancholy array. Before them went the priest, reading the burial service while the leaves of his book were rustling through the breeze. And it goes on, and I don't think I need to read you more. I think those of you who might be familiar with or understand where I'm going, it's here, and it is, I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, the service like a drum kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again, and space began to toll as all the heavens were a bell and being but an ear and eyes and silence, some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank and reason broke, and I dropped down and hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing. Then, and I think Dickinson of all of us got Hawthorne the best. So that's where I would sort of conclude, and thank you all for your attention.
That is incredible. I want to make up 2 points from what you all said. I think that's a great point about students growing up with social media, and this is the age of the memoir. And so you're all upfront about what happens and stuff like that, which is exactly the opposite of what Hawthorne does. And in a recent book on Hawthorne, I interviewed a whole mess of people that were forced to read The Scarlet Letter in high school, and they hated it. And then they read it again in their 30s and 40s, and they loved it. So we got in these conversations. They took that decorous, quiet, almost elegant, almost British style on the surface, and it took a teacher or mentor or something.
It took you.
Well, to point out the ambiguities, and the famous line of Goodman Brown in the forest, and how the light is this, and blah, blah, blah. They missed any ambivalence, ambiguity whatsoever. And they thought Hawthorne was so boring, unlike Poe, because of his very passionate, almost memoir-like, subjective tales. Unlike Poe, you have to go down under. And so that was an interesting phenomenon. The other thing was that you talk about the veil, and I agree that it seems to me in many ways, for Hawthorne, the veil is almost like the ultimate icon or image of the self. It's not so much what the black veil means in the minister's black veil as it is how much power the people themselves give to that veil, obsessed with that veil. And then they seem possessed by the veil, as though the veil turns on them and they're suddenly addicted to it, all because of the Calvinism and stuff like that. But I think that's how Hawthorne works. That okay, there are all these Wakefield, all these people, Giovanni, and I won't go through Robin, all those people, and they have an obsession. And as they get into the story, they get focused on some particular object. The Peabody review, Monika, that you read, I thought was really good. And they get so obsessed that they cross some line where the object seems to possess them, that it becomes a kind of idolatry and they can't pull back from it. So the image of the veil has something to do with the style he writes, which is not passionate and flaming like Poe, but is very quiet. So if our antennae aren't up, at least in high school, you tend to slide across. I mean, in the high school, when they remembered it, said they found the Scarlet Letter boring and blah, 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 blah. And then we got talking about all the stuff that was going on in it. And they weren't shocked, but they were stunned. They didn't, pick up on that. So the veiling is everything that all three of you have just said, whether it's historical imagination, the incredible difference of the reviews, or Brenda in talking about dislocation. It all fits together. The thing that's difficult about this panel is I want to talk for another 3 hours, and I always have that sense that I am going to figure out Hawthorne once and for all, and then I can stop and move on. And it doesn't end. It's to use Chuck's line, resisting closure. Hawthorne is so deceptive. He lures you in, and I always feel if I just read that story one more time, I'll get it. I'll find the answer. That's probably left over from high school. What's the theme? Kind of thing. Do you think, and we have one question coming in here, but first I want to ask, do you think there is, okay, another way, the 19th century made a big deal out of Hawthorne's style, placid, peaceful, decorous, blah, 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 blah. And then if they went further, they would say, but the style is used to tell these very morbid stories. So they would split Hawthorne down the middle and praise the style again and again and again, like a fresh morning in May. And then some of them might say, but why does he focus on adultery? Why is there so much death? Why is there all this darkness and shadow in it? And I wonder if any of the three of you would like to comment, if you experienced that yourself or heard about it, of the clash, if that's not a good word, the style as a veil of darker things, that the 19th century could praise the style and didn't know quite how to handle what they referred to as the morbidity of his tales. Does that strike you as a valid point or an interesting possible point?
But Melville, just to jump in, and sorry to do that, but I think Monika's made some reference. Melville's kind of 2-part long, powerful review of Moss's says that what you're calling morbidity, that power of darkness, that ability to say no in thunder, is what Hawthorne's all about. And that was 1850, 1851. I mean, that's pretty early on. And at the time, Melville hadn't quite ruined his reputation. So he was still, with Moby Dick, he was still considered someone to listen to. So I'm not sure that Hawthorne was berated for being morbid any more than anyone else, even to this day. I mean, when I've taught in the past, Emily Dickinson, and invariably people say, "Oh, why is she so interested in death?" You know, it's like, well,
Isn't that like just the part of the romantic capital R genre tradition that all romantic novels, capital R again, romanticism, they end with death? And I'm thinking about the Melville review as well, where he says, yeah, sometimes there's a little bit too much darkness in Hawthorne, but maybe that's due to his like Puritan past, the Calvinist sense of original sin is with him. Of course, and you also have Hawthorne's guilt trip that he was part of. His ancestors were part of the Salem witch trial. So what are you going to do with that if you know that you put innocent people to death?
And I want you all to know, morbidity is not my word. That was a 19th century word that keeps popping up when they say beautiful writer, but kind of thing. And the style is such that today's students, even seniors in college, have difficulty getting beneath that style, which I found interesting. So
just one more thing though. I think my sense is that the reason they have trouble getting beneath it, besides they're just not used to it and it's not a style that is easily available to them, is that, and this is, I almost didn't bring, it's hard to bring this up because it seems like such a cliche when you come to Hawthorne, is they just don't get irony.
Yeah, that's true.
They just don't get the irony. It's not the morbidity. They can get that. They can get the terror. You know, even I got the terror, but you don't necessarily get the irony, it seems to me. And that's what they miss, you know, in the kind of way he's sort of sticking the knife in a little bit, and they miss it. And I mentioned chiefly about war matters, but he's consistently he almost in some cases cruelly ironic, and it's so interesting, and that's very difficult, it seems to me, for people to understand. But that's just me.
No, it's not just you. I think it's a great idea. Irony is so true to me that I don't trust people who don't have a sense of irony. Now, maybe that's from growing up in the Northeast, but if someone comes on sweet and friendly and loving, and you know, they don't know, I could be a terrorist, a bank robber, or whatever, you know, I immediately pull back, saying they're up to something. They're veiled. They're wearing a veil. They're not really like this kind of. I'm going to go to the question Q&A. You see at the bottom of your screen, it says 1 over to the right. You see it? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Sam, I want to just throw a quick wrench while we're looking at that. I just want to say apropos of where you guys are going, that I was really struck by what Brenda said about her high school reading, the young Brenda Wineapple reader, that the stories don't make any sense, and that stuck with you, Brenda. And to me, that's what I'm always trying to teach our students. That's where I'm trying to get them to go. And you were already there. And part of the challenge that I find is that they're resistant to that not making any sense. And they especially don't want multiple senses to keep coming up in that recursive way I'm talking about. So, and that's of course connected to irony, because that's a tool of that. And one of the things I'm wondering, and maybe we could connect this back to the question about the sketches and is it a different person, is that I see Hawthorne's long self-representation. You know, I've actually sort of pieced together all his prefaces and public pronouncements and made it like a little book. Because to me, it is that maybe there's something in this age of, you know, Instagram selves and Facebook selves, that he has something to teach us about that. Because what I see there available, if we can present it in the right way, is that this is a performed self. And he's showing us that it's that as he does it. And if there's some way to connect that to the you know, age of revelation, because Instagram photos don't reveal any more than his, what he calls a little preliminary talk reveals. So we have a generation that intuitively and daily practices you know, performances, self-representation, and there's got to be some way to connect the two, you know.
I think it's right on target. I mean, I draw the line. I review lots and lots of books all over the place. I've drawn the line since now. I will not read memoirs. I don't care if people have slept with beasts. I don't care if they've killed their mothers. I don't, and go on and on. I said, okay, deal with it. I don't want to read that just because I find it too much of a performance. Anyway,
But you can think of all writing as a performance. I mean, I think,
well, yeah, that's true.
I mean, I understand what you're saying, Sam, but I think, Chuck, you've answered your own question. I mean, if you put together all these self-presentations, that itself is so fascinating, but the downside has nothing to do with Hawthorne. It has to do with people who don't realize what they're putting on Instagram or whatever. What do I know? I'm not on it, but it's a representation. I wouldn't say it's false, but because it's part of one's kind of.
Yeah, didn't Hawthorne say at some point, you're not going to find me in my prefaces where I'm talking, you're going to find me in the characters, not what I say about myself.
Yeah,
Look for me in the characters that I create.
Yeah, that's the 1851 Twice Told Tales preface. Yeah.
But I think you've got a great teaching device in just doing that, just starting from that vantage point, Chuck. I mean, you've nailed it pretty much, it seems to me. And it's a great entrance. I mean, it seems to me that the Scarlet Letter, on the other hand, going back to what Sam was saying, I was invited after my book on Hawthorne came out to a high school to talk in New York City. And they were reading the Scarlet Letter, and it was an inner city school. And they started kicking and screaming, but they were so enthralled by it because it was about a single mother. They got it, in that sense. So I think that's easier in many ways than the Marble Fawn at one extreme or Twice Told Tales at another. I mean, I think that's tough going. It really is, for better or worse. But anyway,
which is always there in fiction memoirs or whatever, now has become it's one of the cliches of postmodernism. Think of Philip Roth and think of all these kind of people and stuff like that. I mean, I've worked my whole life to be glib and superficial. It's been very, very difficult, but I've tried my damnedest to do it. And eventually I hope to arrive at that level. Let's check the question and answer on, it says number 1 at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to put it on, and I'm going to says Poe asserts that some of the works in Twice Told Tales are actually not tales, but rather essays. Little Andy's Ramble, blah, blah, blah. The essays apparently involve no characters other than the author. Did Hawthorne bring different aims and sensibilities to the tale versus essays, especially with respect to Hawthorne's historical imagination and moral questions? Is Poe's distinction a cogent one? And I'm going to press answer live. So Philip, can you hear us?
He won't be able to hear you. You can just ask the question and pose it to the panelists here.
Okay.
I brought that up in my discussion, I guess, with Poe saying I don't like when he's doing these whatever, they're not stories, they're sketches, they're essays. And it's interesting that critics at that time probably enjoyed those stories more than we ever did.
Yeah.
19th century, those were well received, but today we kind of stay away from them.
Monika, do you think you look at all the different things that you've pointed out, and Chuck has too, all the different things that Hawthorne has written, from sketches to essays to sitting in a meadow for a whole day and writing about what he sees? Do you think part of it, to go back to Brenda's thing about authenticity, you think part of it comes from Hawthorne's searching for readers, that he's trying different, I don't know, performances,
Yeah.
see, not to see what sells, but to see what direction he should go in as a writer? Does that in one way help explain why he has written so many different kinds of things? And anybody can answer. I mean, I don't mean to pick on.
I mean, this also goes back to his notebooks. I think he has many good ideas there that sound like this is a good idea for a sketch that you're describing. And so he just picks on any creative moment to not foster his career, but to get an idea to write about. Also when I was talking before about the realist, which goes with sketches and realists, and Brenda was talking about Hawthorne as modernist, it was Broadhead who wrote the essay Hawthorne Among the Realists and compares Hawthorne to Howells. It's been a book long time ago, American Realism. So I'm not quite sure he's not playing around with different ways of writing.
Yeah.
Maybe he's aware that I'm doing a different kind of writing here.
And Chuck, with that, with your thing about historical imagination, in a lot of his stories, he will take what the prepackaged historical tale is about, and then is it Roger Melvin's Burial, where he presents the historical understanding of an episode, and then as he writes about it, thoroughly undercuts it. I mean, just rips it to shreds.
Yeah, the inside story. I mean, I think that your first question right at the beginning about readership and constructing readership is intimately tied to what Monika just pointed out about discovering, ways of writing, modes of writing, what writing is really for him. And it's connected to, I like the phrase, Joel Pfister's recent book, Surveyors of Custom.
Yeah.
And he's surveying the American scene. And what is there here to, spark the imagination, to comment on, to engage. And there's things in the present just as much as there are things in the annals of New England. So that's part of how I see it. I don't know. I think his way of looking is sort of connected across the various modes he uses. But another side of it is that he's definitely aware of and thinking about a transatlantic audience. So I think that's a reality. I work, doing work on the essay, The Old Manse, and, the English extensively quoted from The Old Manse. And in some ways, The Old Manse is a compendium of everything he did in the Twice Told Tales. In there are the historical anecdotes and sort of subtle analysis and critique. In there are the rambles and the observations about the day and nature and everything. And, Irving, it's not unlike the range of Irving's sketchbook. And that to me is another thing about when you look at, as Monika beautifully categorized the different tales, when you look at all of that range, I see a mind, looking acutely at the American scene and finding his own variation on available modes of writing. So in other words, he learned things from English sketch writers. He did learn things from Walter Scott and Fenimore Cooper. Somebody mentioned Last the Mohican in the chat. And
well, it's interesting too. What I want to pick up, because we're kind of running out of time. But when Brenda talked about the sins of the fathers and stuff like that, which when it comes to Hawthorne really is a kind of cliche. It's not passing the buck, but it just assumes, his attitude toward his ancestors. And he said, I'm a little bit like them too, all of which is true. But what I found really interesting, looking around for today's conversation, in Philip Roth's novel, The Human Stain, which is one of my favorites. In the second, it's about Clinton's impeachment and Monica Lewinsky. And Roth talks about the White House. He said, I'm going to go to the White House and put a big sign over the White House that says, a human being lives here. And he quotes Hawthorne and saying, what this country loves to do, and I'm misquoting because I can't remember it exactly. What this country loves to do is exercise the persecuting spirit, to point fingers. Boy, do we see evidence of that today. And it seems to me another performing part of Hawthorne's fiction is his villains, even his innocent young men who always screw things up, that there's this persecuting spirit that isn't the whole of his work by any matter of means, but is under there, kind of almost like seeking out victims. It's your fault. What's the Reverend Hooper up to? Is he insane? What happened to Major Molyneux, et cetera, et cetera? We've got a couple minutes left. Does anyone want to add to that? I was going to ask about the American. We've covered a lot of the things that came up, but I'm wondering if there's any other aspect of Hawthorne that either troubles you or you've resolved, or that's coming out in your next book, or coming out in your memoirs that you'd like to share with the public.
I would just go back to your excellent point just now, Sam, about the persecuting spirit, and say that I going back to the ambitious guest, which I thought a lot about for this particular program, the storyteller, Hawthorne is deeply sensitive to the storyteller as a potential persecutor. And I think he's ambivalent about storytelling, and storytelling itself is very powerful, and back to your point, everyone is a persecutor, and that's what's so kind of compelling about Hawthorne. As soon as you think someone's a villain, they have been themselves victimized, so that it's always spinning around in some particular
And I want to
way.
add to that, right on target, that Hawthorne found mesmerism morally repugnant, but he found it psychologically accurate. And so what you bring up, it's a really good topic, is storytelling is getting control of another supposedly individual soul or autonomous self. And maybe part of Hawthorne's guilt was having that power to do that, the spell binding he was so good at. He always, like everything, he always felt guilty about. I think it's
like Holgrave in The House of Seven Gables telling the story.
Yeah.
And Phoebe falls asleep, and he knows that she's under my power at the moment with the storytelling I'm doing.
Yes.
And
He wants that power. That's the thing. He wants that power.
Yeah.
It's the desire for it. And I think that kind of again, going back to the sort of push-pull, he wants it, but he wants to try to tamp it down a little bit. And that tension, I think you find right in the sentences themselves.
Well, that brings me back to one of those haunting texts, Alice Stone's Appeal, that he never recollected, which stages that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's wonderful. Everybody should go read Alice Stone's Appeal. What, Sam?
I say you can see him staging Alice Stone's Appeal. It's kind of a mess, but it's fascinating. Like, it hasn't quite come together yet, but you see him setting all the incestuous relationships and stuff, and he doesn't quite know what to make of it, but he can do it. And the idea of power, control, mesmerism, whatever, with the persecuting spirit, that's really interesting. I mean, I think you can make a lot out of that. If he was ambivalent about everything, he was certainly ambivalent about storytelling. Anything else would anyone like to add? I think we're probably out of time. I'm not really keeping time. Are we? Do we have
3:23.
Okay, so we've got 7 minutes. I was born when I was very young, many years ago. No, was there anything that people would like to add? Thank you all for smiling. I appreciate that.
Why did Hawthorne stop writing stories?
Yeah.
He was a better story writer than novelist, except for Scarlet Letter.
I think Feathertop was 1854, the last one.
My contention is that, well, everybody knows that Scarlet Letter started as a story. It's kind of, if you best to understand it as a long story, but I think House of Seven Gables, which is kind of jury built in a sense, was begun as a story, and that he added sections to it. So
I've always found The Marble Fawn extremely difficult and messed up, and I've read it about 10 times because I love it. But I love it because of the dysfunction or something. Scarlet Letter is where everything's balanced. The balance is perfectly balanced.
He gets it right there.
And then after that, it starts to come unglued somehow.
I love the unglued text. Septimius Felton is where it's just caught my imagination.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And Marble Fawn. Yeah. I want to end with the answer to Brenda's question: who reads a Hawthorne book?
Mm-hmm.
And I wish that the people we can't hear could tell us that. You know,
They do.
what gets people to read a Hawthorne book?
For a message, right? Anyway, thank you all very much. Thanks to Chris Kendall. Thanks to Chance Layton. Thanks for inviting us, setting us up, allowing us to expound on great scholarly, the depths of our consciousness and souls and hearts, which we will continue even after this conversation into our next books and classes and whatever.
And thank you, Sam, for moderating.
Thank you, Sam.
Listen, when you have a panel like this, all you got to do is sit back and let them talk, and they're going to talk. So appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Thank you, everybody. I greatly appreciate it. To the audience, you will be receiving a follow-up email with a link to this recording, so you may share it. Within that email, there's also a link to a PDF, which includes links to all of the people's books who are speaking today, so you can go and purchase those as you please. And thank you all for joining. Sam, Monika, Brenda, Chuck, thank you very much. Talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Good to see you.
Take
Nice
care.
to
Thank
meet
you
you.
all.